Okay, well, welcome everyone. We're so thrilled to be starting off our winter uh, series, Pushing the Boundaries of Qualitative Inquiry. I'm Sarah Doro, and I am the director of the International Institute for Qualitative Methodology here at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, or Amiskwaciwâskahikan, in Canada. And I'm really pleased to welcome you all. We're focused this year in pushing the boundaries on the power of storytelling and narrative in qualitative research. And this is the first of three series that will or three talks that we'll have in this series. And if you want to find out more, you can go to our website, and I've just put that link in the chat. IIQM has been here at the University of Alberta for about 25 years or so, and we are dedicated to advancing qualitative methodologies through community building, like this event today, training and sharing research and knowledge in qualitative methods. So now to the main event. I would like to introduce our moderator. Aidan Blockley is a master's student in public health here at the University of Alberta. Thank you, Aidan, so much for taking on this role today. So I'll hand things over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. So before I get started, I want to thank Sarah Duro and Jillian for inviting me to moderate this discussion. We're in for a great presentation from Dr. Christopher Sonn. I also want to thank Jovi Krieger, who has supported us in preparing for today's event and will be serving as technological support. So as we said, my name is Aidan Blockley. I'm a Master of Science student in public health, and I'm currently conducting research with LGBTQIA plus refugees using narrative inquiry in Amiskwaciwâskahikan, which is the Nahiawak name for the city settler colonizers have decided to name Edmonton. The Nakota Sioux call this place Tioda, or many houses, and the Niitsitapi call it Omakoi, which is a big lodge. I'm joining from Treaty 6 territory, which is the territory of the Nahiawak, Dene, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Nakota Sioux, as well as the Métis people. I am a settler and an immigrant of English and Irish descent, originally born on the stolen land of the Suwalluguatiji, which are the eastern band of the Cherokee, as well as the Miccosukee peoples. I offer this land acknowledgement in full knowledge that settler colonialism is ongoing and continues to cause harm to Indigenous peoples and to the land itself, and that we all have a duty to dismantle settler colonialism within our lifetimes. Today, we have a special speaker whom I will introduce in a minute. Dr. Christopher Sonn will speak for around 45 minutes, followed by a short, moderated discussion. Afterward, we will invite questions and comments from everyone in the chat using the Q&A function. Feel free to write out your questions for Dr. Sonn anytime in the Zoom Q&A function. Please try to keep your questions short and succinct. We will read out each question roughly in the order that they come in, and we will summarize questions if needed, if the questions are written in longer text. And now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker. So Dr. Christopher Sonn is based at Victoria University in Australia with the Mundani Baluk Indigenous Academic Centre and the Institute for Health and Sport, as well as the Community Identity Displacement Research Network, which he co-founded. He holds a visiting position at the University of Witwatersrand, and his research is focused on the lived experience of migrant populations, racialized people, as well as other marginalized groups in Australia and South Africa. Through his publications, he has contributed to the understanding of apartheid through the lens of liberation and community psychology, in addition to an understanding of the psychosocial and political praxis of apartheid and other forms of oppression and resistance in Australia. His recent work has focused on decoloniality, placemaking, and fostering solidarities through critical community-engaged research and action. Christopher is co-author of numerous publications that appear in leading journals and books, including the book Social Psychology and Everyday Life. He is also the co-editor of Decoloniality, Knowledge Production, and Epistemic Justice in Community Psychology, co-authored with Garth Stevens, as well as the Handbook of Community Psychology, which came out in 2024. He is an associate editor of the American Journal of Community Psychology and Community Psychology in Global Perspective. Today, Dr. Sonn will be giving his talk titled Expanding Methods in Epistemic Communities, Mobilizing Arts and Creative Methods to Foster Community, Identity, and Well-Being. Welcome, Dr. Sonn, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Aidan. Thank you also, Sarah, Gillian, Jovi, for inviting me to do this webinar. I'll just get this process here going to share my screen. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for this opportunity. Firstly, I'd like to say that I live and work on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nation. I acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. I recognize my colleagues at Mundani Balak, the Indigenous Centre, where I work. I acknowledge their struggles, resilience, and survivance. I'm grateful that they have welcomed me and included me in the spaces that they continue to create to heal, recover, and decolonize. I'd also like to acknowledge all of the peoples from the different countries and lands who are joining, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging from those contexts also. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a journey with the collective that we have started here in Victoria some years ago. And here we've got a sort of a drawing that one of our PhD students, our current PhD students, draws. She's a drama therapist. And this is us at a conference some years ago in an Atlanta community psychology conference, the first one just after COVID. And so this is a sort of a depiction of the group with all of the people who we collectively create work with, and we've got a very strong sort of concern for various aspects of power, the intersections of power, and how we use and engage with each other. So this is a sampling of the people, but the most interesting part of this is that the student actually engages and uses this form of art in her own research and research practice. So these are some of the questions that have preoccupied me, and I think us a little bit more recently. I'll take you on a little bit of a journey of earlier foundational work and how and where we are now, and in particular these sorts of questions. And for me, I haven't called myself a settler yet. I'm still navigating, but I'm a migrant from South Africa. I'm a fifth generation mixed race and cultural ancestry, and I grew up during the apartheid period in South Africa, and we've navigated and managed our transition to Australia. I think we came here on a visa and was meant to go back in 3 years, but I've been living and making life in the Australian context now for over 35 years. So these questions that we have now, I guess, is to some extent sets of questions that emerges out of navigating and coming to think about what it means to be in a university, but also what it means to think about and produce knowledge within university in relation to and with communities of people who don't typically see themselves in university contexts. So part of the questions that we've been framing is around reimagining and deepening the university community relationship, and to some extent troubling both university and community by attending to the dynamics of power and how this shapes and influences who is in the university, who can be in it, and how we mobilize and create spaces and craft spaces for those who typically see themselves as not belonging to or being in university spaces. But we also want to trouble the idea of community, which often can be fairly homogenizing and flatten the various diversities and dimensions of power historically constituted that shapes and influences people's lived and everyday realities and opportunities for what we've borrowed from Kelly, an African American scholar, for freedom dreaming. So a lot of the work that we think about is how can we create spaces, counter spaces in particular, and how do we connect those counter spaces up with the various flows of privilege and power, not only in the Australian context, but across the global south and north. So they ended up being fairly broad questions because we've come to understand the interconnected histories between north, south, east, west, and so forth. But we also keep it fairly local because we are interested in how we mobilize and think about freedom dreaming through cultural practice and critical solidarity practice, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. So part of the, I mean, part of the part of what I need to contextualize also is that, I mean, I sit in community, or I've trained in community psychology, which is a sort of a radical, well, probably not radical anymore, some would argue, but it's a discipline that committed itself to be a values-based practice. It was interested in the notions of empowerment. It responded to the limitations of a very narrow application of psychology. And it sought to understand context, history, peoples, and how we can develop models that move beyond a side discourse or a psychologization of issues that starts outside or is produced by structures and structures of inequality. So I've been engaging in this discipline, looking and trying to find the sorts of ways in which we can not reproduce the discipline, but the way in which we can put disciplines to the service of issues, challenges that people face in everyday life. So it's been an ongoing sort of pursuit of how do we expand and think through the issues as they manifest in terms of epistemic inclusion, epistemic exclusion, and the narrowness of the categories that often is produced within university settings. So I've been researching and thinking about displacement, and I'd imagine that some of these sorts of concerns moves and are relevant across disciplines. So the idea of weird psychology is the limited decontextualized sorts of approaches, the universalist tendencies in the discipline, but it's also been about finding and excavating psychologies that have always been on the margin. So whether they are indigenous psychologies, Black psychologies, Steve Biko in South Africa and the work that he's produced during the 60s, 70s around liberation perspectives, and other writers like Hussein Bulhan, who wrote an amazing book in 1985, I think, on Frantz Fanon and the psychology of oppression, and so forth. I mean, but this gives you a sense that we are looking at how, I mean, what are those knowledges that's available, that are there, that have been excluded, and how might they be mobilized in the service of the sorts of issues that continues to affect people's lives negatively. Um, this is another sort of representation of the work as we've come to engage with it, and we sort of call the solidarity praxis, and it's still part of this idea of how do we produce and create inclusive knowledges at the interface of university community, and the interface is extremely important here. And so we've sort of captured some of this with, and I've got a colleague and friend and former PhD student, Sam Keys, who whenever we speak, he will be writing down, and I think he's very creative in capturing some of the conversations that we have about what our meta project looks like. So Sam created this, and we were talking about ecologies of well-being and just the spaces and settings, I think, where people feel safe, where people feel included, and so forth. And it's a play on the term of expanding ecologies of knowledge, about whose knowledges are included, whose realities are included when we have conversations. And so we've thought about solidarity praxis in multiple ways as forms of standing up for, standing up as, standing up with. And this comes from, I think, a biomedical ethical scholar who wrote about some of the multiple ways in which solidarity is expressed in research and in community engaged work. So we've sort of assembled this and said that our hopes ultimately is about thinking about and always questioning what does it mean to be doing work at the interface of universities, communities, and what does it mean to be doing work from the communities that we are who we are members of, and ideally to support and materialize these hopes. We argue that it is necessary to move from monological theories and approaches that are often decontextualized, ahistorical, and individualistic. So this little representation here has some of the sorts of things that we critique around neoliberal well-being, neoliberal subjectivities, dehumanizing approaches that often sit at the heart of biomedical or positivist approaches within applied social community and community engaged work, and this idea of how do we understand other knowledges that is not produced in weird settings. We've then also started to think through what does epistemic justice look like? What does relational praxis look like? What does it mean for us to engage in relational modalities of knowledge production? How and what is available and possible through decolonial, not just as a critique of coloniality, but decoloniality as a project. I often think about it as a project of embrace. And then this concept that comes from a Brazilian Afro-Indigenous scholar, Danilo Guimarães, who speaks about dialogical multiplication. And these are the various dialogues that are possible from Indigenous informed knowledges into and in conversation with Western derived knowledges, and Western being a broad sort of category there. But we are also very interested in what does this look like and feel like in terms of research and research encounters with communities. And so we are interested in what are modalities that stretches beyond interviews or focus groups. What are the various ways in which people sense the world, and how can we mobilize those in the service of creating ecologies of well-being as a broad set of questions. So I'm focusing on some of the arts-oriented projects in this talk. So with that broad sort of overview of that, there is a big context for this work, including, I guess, lots of writing by scholars across numerous countries. And I mean, one of the things for us too has been that often in journals we'll see particular ways in which people legitimize and think about research and what we represent and how we represent research and who gets to represent it. So at the heart of a lot of this, there is this desire and this need for to understand the importance of the epistemic aspects of the work that we do, about what does it mean to be producing knowledges, on whose terms, who for, and by whom. So this particular representation that we have here draws from Helene Schulman and Mary Watkins, who wrote a wonderful book in 2008 called The Psychology of Liberation. It's a very comprehensive text, and in it there's one chapter too that specifically thinks about arts, creativity within various participatory projects. And so we've also been engaging with this and thinking with this text to think about how we mobilize community arts. In Australia, community arts is not just community-led, but there's a very strong policy framework that also supports community-engaged arts, although arts is always on the margins and at risk of funding being pulled as well. So it's always precarious in lots of ways. But we're interested in how do we use arts and cultural activity, and how do we think about cultural practice, and whose cultural practice, whose versions of practice is valued. But like I said before, it's also about multimodality and the multiple ways in which people create and share knowledge. So this is just an example of some of the sorts of things, or some of the methods, some of the modalities, and then also some of the shared qualities of arts oriented work that we've been interested in doing. That it is participatory, it is about engaging with the ideas of consciousness or awareness, consciousness raising. It can be unpredictable because it impacts in lots of different ways, and people often feel art as opposed to just register cognitively and rationalizing it. It is proactive, it's creative, it's dialogical, it decenters, and it seeks to be transformative, and often transformative in terms of individual experiences, but collectively through exhibitions and so forth. It also creates a possibility for collective narratives to be transformed or new ones to be made visible. So in our group, the Community Identity and Displacement Research Network, we've also been looking at and accumulating over maybe over 10 years now. And I've got a little link, and thanks to Angela, we've got some QR codes as well for thinking about the task that we set for ourselves in terms of university and community partnerships, and what this looks like when we reimagine the university, and who we are reimagining it for. So we have here an article that I think we recently published too, that talks about, look, what are some of the sorts of ways in which we are imagining and enacting methods, and so within a sort of a surveying of work in qualitatively oriented critical community psychology, and beyond that, we sort of looked at the importance of positionality, critical reflexivity, not just as a positional statement, but our positionality as a way to engage with power, to make visible particular sets of commitments, and to understand our location when we engage with research, and as something that is very central to qualitative research. We often see, and we are in a place as outsiders in Indigenous space. I mean, what are Indigenous knowledges, Indigenous communities? What are the calls? What are the aspirations and the desires that comes out of the long history of Indigenous ways of knowing, doing, and being in the world? A lot of the work is about a centering analysis of colonialism, not just outside of the academy, but also inside it and inside disciplines, and how it's expressed there. And then others talk about the importance of approaching and co-producing knowledge with communities. And this raises all sorts of questions too, not just about co-design, but how do we think through the relational aspects of community, of knowledge production, and then also this idea of mutual accompaniment, which comes out of liberation theology, liberation literature as well. So in our context, there's a sampling of things that we've done, and I'll talk about three of these projects: the Apartheid Archive project, Next in Color, Future Reset, and also Indigenous placemaking. But the listing that I've got there talks a little bit about the fact that in projects people use songwriting. One of our recent PhD students was part of learning how to produce radio, and this is a project also that came out of the COVID period. So it's not just about doing the radio, but it's understanding and documenting and examining qualitatively the sorts of processes involved in creating spaces where young people can curate, narrate, and perform their own stories through this digital modality. We have some theater-based projects, and the most recent one was Ming Bi, which is a Chinese word, I mean, magical brush, but it's a student who produced theater pieces informed by Bualian theater to engage people from the Chinese diaspora in explorations around mental health literacy. So it's an iterative theater production that she produced to produce, but also to understand the dynamics of enhancing or fostering literacy about mental health. Then there's some of the more popular ones, photo voice, photo elicitation, and so forth. And and of course the very popular podcasting processes. So I'll speak a little about that now. Um, so the apartheid archive project is something that we started many years ago in South Africa, and I was a member of the research team based in Australia. And the project came out of a desire to understand what the desire to understand, but also the need for the everyday stories of people who grew up during apartheid to be documented, and also to understand what it means and how have people digested and how are people digesting the experiences of having lived during apartheid, other than the grand narratives of the time, and also the ones that have been raised through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and so forth. So that project was based on the importance of storytelling, and storytelling is as a way to know and to represent in the world, and it intersects with memory, how people remember um, their past in the present, and how, as researchers, we can accompany part of that process. And then how people metabolize or how people deal with or are not able to deal with experiences of the past, but what it means to be able to lift those and make them visible in the present. So that project we documented, and then we also had a little team who did some of this work in the Australian context. So one of the projects that came out of the Apartheid Archive project for us was to also understand what it means for people who were differently positioned in South Africa in terms of the racial hierarchy there, and how their experiences translate into the Australian context. And so our team there with uh, Alison Baker. Alison Baker is actually from lived in Australia, but grew up most of her life in Canada. And then Kirsten Meyer and Gavin Ivey were two colleagues, both migrants from South Africa also. And so we organized this team to look at how might we um, collect stories from different people. So African, or people racially classified as Black, people who are racially classified as white, and people who are racially designated colored in South Africa, and their experiences as we move from one place to the other, and what it means to engage with different racialized or race-based ideologies that organizes countries. Um, so, so, so this is part of the project that we developed in the Australian context, and so it is called the Voices of Displacement. And we did this. I mean, it seemed to be fairly straightforward. Our idea was, we should do a documentary about this, but for a lot of people, that now people don't want to have their faces visible. They would rather be anonymous. So we devised a project that was pretty much based on how will we collect stories through interview, but we also brought in we called it arts informed, and it's how might we use particular objects that people bring that represents home, South Africa, and that represents the present, Australia, as part of the sets of conversations that we have about growing up in South Africa and then experiences of moving to Australia. So this project yielded a number of sorts of conversations, fairly in-depth conversations with people talking about their past and present. And we decided with people that we'd want to move this out of the academic space, out of the university journal, out of the journals, although the publication part of it was important. But how might we share these stories? So with Alison in particular, we created um, this podcasting was becoming fairly popular, and so we ended up having this conversation about how we might represent people's stories in a public sphere, and how we might use various sounds from South Africa, from Australia, and so forth to tell a story about the migration journey and to weave different voices together um, in talking about the different ways in which people navigated migration, displacement, and life making, and how race and culture and structural location influences those various narrations across. So this is what this project ended up looking like. So these images here represent a little bit about what we created. The sound portraits, which is the audio documentary techniques, and the qualitative interviews that we collected, and the narratives that people conveyed about the experiences of dislocation, the experiences of life making, and how that differs as people navigate various aspects of race and gender in the Australian context, but also informed by the stories of life as when they grew up in South Africa. So the images here are from the exhibition that we produced, and it was a sound installation. So nothing visual. Everything was when we did the exhibition, people were invited to sit around, and we played the sound portrait, which ran for about 12 minutes or so. Then we also created this graffiti wall for people to respond. So a lot of it was about hearing, perceiving, and encountering, not through the visual, but auditory. And then also invitations for people to respond to that. So I'll see if I can play this little clip just to give people a sense of what the actual sound portrait that we created sounded like.
What do I love about Cape Town?
One
Oh,
word.
everything.
What do you love about Cape Town? I said community. Huh? Community. Community. That's it.
It's amazing just to get together with your own people, and you feel that it's like a little South Africa. You can't let those roots go. You can't, because it's part of you. You grew up with it. So.
Okay, so that that portrait, that's a little snippet there. So the sounds that we've got there, we gathered some of the sounds at a community gathering. So we're very engaged with the community in the Australian context too. And so the sound portrait was constructed weaving through various soundscapes that we collected. Kirsten collected some when she went to South Africa, and others collected some in the Australian context. And so we wove through the migration encounter, the encounter with race, and some of people's future imaginings about what life will be like here and so on. So people can go listen to that at the website. But we found some of the questions that people asked us was about the politics of sound, who gets to select narratives, who gets to select sounds, and how we wove those sounds together. And others asked us questions about how do you think about race, or how do you what are the sorts of discourses that influences this? Because a lot of this is about the sorts of ways in which we undo the sorts of registers that have come to be under our skin. So the registers of race and gender and so forth, but also what are the registers in terms of who South Africa belonged to, who felt safe and comfortable claiming South Africa as a place, and how differently positioned people remember and use memory of South Africa, of family, of place, of landscape, in recreating and rerouting lives in the Australian context. Okay. So the work that we did during and with the Apartheid Archive project was quite important in terms of the idea of looking at whose stories are we interested in and whose stories matter. And in the South African the Apartheid Archive project, we had we had to make this effort to say that why it is important to engage with people's stories, people whose stories are not typically in official scripts, not in the textbooks, um, who are excluded from history. And so the idea was that we need to actually have a restorative project, an epistemic intervention. And so the Apartheid Archive project became part of, and we know and we understand that it has to be a longer term project of accumulating and building up knowledges from the margins. So for me, a lot of this work, a lot of those foundational sorts of desires, aspirations, and values also influence the work in the Australian context, including the work with the group now called Next in Color. And this is a group made up of young people from different countries on the African continent who we've been working with also for a very long time in terms of thinking through how we might support through research and through documenting and through critically reflecting with them about the ways in which they are, the desires that they have, because they often said to me that, look, we want to create something that we didn't have when we grew up as young people from the African diaspora. What are the spaces that we can create so that those who come after us will have spaces, will have representation, and will see themselves in public discourses? So this little group started with a health organization, but they ended up becoming the self-determined collective called Next in Color. And so you can see there, the part of the work that we documented was how do they go about creating safe spaces, practices, and processes in which they can self-determine the projects that they want to do, the funding that they need to generate, and how they can support memories from home, not externally imposed ideas about what it means to be African, whether it's an incompatible migrant, or whether it's a traumatized migrant, or whether it's a criminal migrant, or whether the big narrative of African gangs will dictate. So they wanted to tell other stories about, in one of their projects, they talked about black gold. And black gold is the literature, the historical archive of African-centered, African-derived knowledges, and how important it is to understand and know those as resources for future imagining. And so part of the work that they've done was to use art and arts and to create art and to create theater spaces for this. And so this was one of the first, I guess, well, they had lots of other projects, but this is a particularly important one because the whole group there came from very different places, some via the Caribbean and via the UK 2 year, but also lots of young people who are third culture. They call themselves as third culture, as having a fusion of cultures that make up and constitute their own experiences, identities, and so forth. So they used they used theater, storytelling, embodied practice, a whole series of things to talk about the story, the diverse trajectories of being African in the Australian context and the diverse knowledge resources that's available to them to talk about and project new and different old ideas to counter the discourses and narratives about the incompatibility of African young people in the Australian context. So some of these things, and especially the gold masks, I mean, the mask of silencing them, but the gold as also representing that there is a wealth of knowledge there once we lift that mask. So AMCA was an extremely important project that yielded multiple things. It showed their capacity to do this work. It was important for us as researchers from the university to see ourselves as and to accompany the stories, to gather the oral histories, to provide the space for critical reflection on the stories that they want to tell and how they tell them. And that led to a whole body of work that they then created. And those images represent some of the work, but some of the key themes that runs through them is about the creation of settings or home places or safe places away from the everyday assaults of racism, micro violences that happens in everyday sorts of spaces. It's also the space where they dream of what the counter stories will be. They dream and they engage with how do we think about racism, and so forth. So the safe space becomes, or the home place becomes a space of both critical reimagining, but also of very strong psychosocial support. But we're also very engaged in thinking about how do we think outside of the dominant registers and how do we retrieve and engage with Indigenous knowledges? How do we think about what are our community archives, our community knowledges, and how do we bring all of those together to constitute new resources that we can use for identity renarration and identity making? So it's really important, I think, for us and for them, and to understand how do we use arts-based work or arts-based processes, both for as a pedagogy, but also as a form of representation, but also as a way of doing inquiry about subjectivity, about willful subjectivities, about understanding race and contesting race. And so we are embracing these ideas about multimodality beyond talk and text as ways in which we can understand being in the world. So the current work that we do is really concerned with, and I think this is Gloria Dillard who speaks about endarkened epistemologies. And what are these epistemologies from the margins that is not that has been ignored, but that are extremely important to lift and to elevate. And so some of this for us is about Black consciousness, Black aesthetics, migrant or diasporic aesthetics, and what we can learn from those as the points of departure, as opposed to always having to start with a defensive posture against racism. But this is a story that starts with these are the capacities and knowledge trajectories that we can start with. Okay, so those two projects deals with and had a focus on migrancy, South African migrants, African migrants, and it's been centered on storytelling, on multimodality, or the possibilities of multimodal knowing, and how we moved. The other pieces of work is happening with health agencies mostly, and a lot of it took a particular shape after COVID, when people were starting to think about how will we restore social bonds and how will we address this imminent I don't know, I think people here talked about this as a crisis in mental health, and so that have developed post-COVID because of isolation and being disconnected and so forth. So we ended up partnering with an organization with the Victorian Health Foundation to look at supporting their program of work that we're looking at centering participation, relationships, and also youth-led and youth-centered programs that people or young people would do with various stakeholder groups who they're involved with. And part of this also sat within the broader sets of discourses around how do we decolonize, I guess, the public health approach. And a lot of it, I think, in some sorts of ways, were about how do we actually engage communities in shared decision making? How do we value the breadth of cultures to sit alongside? 5 to 10 minutes. To sit alongside professional knowledges and so on. So a lot of this work, I think, has also been driven by a broader set of shifts around how do we move into democratized forms of knowing, not a sort of a token process. What does it mean to actually divest power, to give people to make access to resources available without auditing, but for people to self-determine what will projects of health look like for them? So this is just one project that we've been involved with for a number of years now. And the two voices that we have in here are two young people who were creative leads in some of this work. And so we've interviewed all of them, and you can find their stories on a set of podcasts that we created. And so you will see that the praxis of research, the idea of storytelling is quite central. So an interview is so much more than just that. There's sorts of ways in which once you create the spaces, or once you are part of the spaces that young people dream of and invite them into it, you can see the sorts of ways in which they lift the structures that constrains their subjectivity. And so both Nikila and Rosie talk a little bit about this. One talks about finding your community, and the other speaks about, the spaces that Aboriginal people need and want to and should have access to, that they can determine for themselves. So I'll play those two little clips now.
I just went to one, and then the next one you'd see everyone at like someone else's event who's still in like that like community, I guess. And they're all very like low key. It's not like this is like my whole like life. It's just like some fun. It was like very much like this light-hearted, I guess, energy towards it. And then yeah, it went from like art galleries and then parties and then like dinners and then they're just there. You know what I mean? They're just there.
Doing vigils, like creating those spaces, doing those things is all about us healing and coming together and resisting at the same time. So it's kind of like, I think resistance and healing for us as First Nations people it coexists. But I think that, the concept of like Western therapy and everything is really interesting to look at because, you're kind of on your own. It's like, all right, you've gone through all this trauma intergenerationally, systemically, individually, but now you've got to go and fix yourself up. And then if you don't, you're a burden and because you don't fit into like this very rigid type of way of being in the world.
So both Rosie and Akila were young arts leaders in this work, and Rosie spoke specifically about what it means to be a young Aboriginal woman who's afforded the space and what the sorts of issues are that they wanted to address. And same with Nikila, who also found herself through this, another person of migrant background. But just the spaces that they are able to create that's freer and where they have autonomy in some of this that they've been doing. So they've been accompanying us in a number of the projects that we're doing now. So just one last one, because I know that I'm running out of time. And this is just the picture of the center where we work. And this garden that you see there was maybe 4 years old, but it was a garden that was created with very strong Indigenous output, and everything in it has been influenced by Aboriginal knowledges through the process of Aboriginal through consulting with Indigenous communities, gathering ancestral knowledges as part of this process to shape and to create spaces. And the pit in the middle is a fire pit. It's a healing space. It's a mourning space. It's a place where even lots of people from the university are often invited when we do a smoking ceremony as a cleansing ceremony, but also as a ceremony of showing respect and inviting people in. And that little colorful banner that runs there is an art piece that Dr. Paula Bella, Wemba Wemba Yoda Yoda woman created that adorns the planter boxes that is around the building, but it's also the logo. It's also on the logo of the center. So for us, quite a bit of it is about reimagining place and relationality. And in the Indigenous context, we've come to, or in our engagements with and being on Indigenous land and with Indigenous people in our specific location, lots of the questions are not so much about coloniality, but they are about how do we engage with and how do we respond to Indigenous knowledge systems as we reimagine the possibilities for belonging in the Australian context and specifically in the Victorian context. And this is ongoing while we've got the processes of treaty, truth-telling, and the formation of the first treaty in Australia that happens in the Victorian context. And so all of those broader sets of issues and challenges, what they look like, feel like, as we engage in thinking newly and differently about what it means for us to co-create and be with and in place with Indigenous people in navigating other possibilities, not ones regulated through being a migrant, other and so forth, but possibilities and solidarities around the relationships that we are entangled with, and questions about what does it mean for us to be in good relations with Indigenous people as we reimagine futures that responds to their calls for land rights, for epistemic inclusion, epistemic justice, and for healing and truth-telling. So our director and our university has this commitment to protecting country as a key driver for our work, and the demands that we listen and learn from country and learn with. And country is a very important concept because we've got lots of Indigenous countries in Australia. But some of the quotations that I have there influences and shapes some of the deep onto epistemic thinking that we need to engage with as we shape and form relationships with Indigenous communities. So place, land, and culture are intimately tied to identity. Indigenous belonging derived from an ontological relationship to country, and country as fundamental to the worldview of First Nations people. So the important coordinates for us. And this last one is an image or sets of images that speaks to the idea of country, of culture and relationality. And they are images from a project that we've called Black Women's Healing. And the flowers, the cloth, the arrangements that you see there is part of a practice that Paula Bella uses in her work called bush dyeing. And so the Black Women's Healing Project responds to the desires and needs of Aboriginal women who've expressed a need for them to be better supported, and especially women who are at the risk of having their children removed by the justice system. So this project was devised to support women to create spaces where we use Indigenous practices, Indigenous knowledges of land, Indigenous knowledges of country, to create spaces where people can talk, they can engage with what it means to be Aboriginal people, especially Aboriginal people who were members of the stolen generations. What might be the memory and retrieval practices that we can support, and how do we create spaces through bush dyeing and other practices that draws from cultural memory to support women in restoring some of the sorts of processes that were disrupted because of colonialism and colonization and the stolen generations and so forth. But here again, we've got sensory aspects and so on. So, and this project in itself also produced only last year a rich exhibition that exhibited the work of the women, the research stories that we collected. And so we're still in a phase of looking to understand the role of these exhibitions as forms of and invitations to public witnessing of stories from below. Um, so I feel like I've spoken very fast and shared lots of things. So a lot of the work that we've been doing and accumulating over time is is also extremely important because it addresses an archive or creates an archive that we see as absent from some of the mainstream literature as reflected in journals and so forth. So there are to some extent knowledges from below, and we are interested in asking the questions about how do we co-create knowledges from below, from indigenous struggles, from community memory, and from diaspora as the basis? How do we mobilize multimodal approaches beyond interviews to elevate the lived concerns in pedagogical imperatives of freedom, anguish, responsibility, agency, and so on? And how do we, and I think I'm going to assume that academia is a fairly privileged space. How do we use the space to redistribute resources within and outside the university where people can feel like they can come in, where their stories will be visible in curriculum, where their identities will be strengthened rather than eroded? And ultimately, how do we recognize our different what are our various loci of enunciation? And how do we use that as a resource, not just as a confessional tale that situates us, but how do we use those various locations critically, reflectively in conversation with other positionings and localities as we dream up work around community liberation and well-being? And I think that's it. Hopefully, I made it on time, Sarah.
You were exactly on time. Thank you so much, Dr. Sun. That was an incredible presentation, and I just want to thank you again for sharing all that wisdom with us, all that experience with us. Um, a quick reminder to our audience that I will start off our discussion with a few questions for Dr. Sun, and then we'll open up for questions from the audience using the Q&A tool. Please go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A, and we will get to as many of them as we can. Our starting discussion should only take around 10 minutes or so. So, to start us off, I wanted to open up with a bit of a discussion around repatriation. So, in lots of discussions about decolonization, the repatriation of lands and knowledge and memories and stories is essential, right? So, I wanted to ask, what are some of the ways that narrative research and community scholar interfaces and partnerships on the whole, how can they contribute to repatriation specifically?
Well, that's a that's a big one. I think the other part of that is in the Australian context. I know scholars, Indigenous scholars like Tony Birch talks about rematriation as well as fairly important here, given the role of Indigenous women as culture holders and so on. So I think look, I would say that part of our effort in the Apartheid Archive project, and you will also see now, I think, when we think about repatriation, about whether we are retrieving artifacts that have been displaced from country into archives, museums in European centers and so forth. So there's that aspect of retrieving stolen histories in lots of ways. So I think for us, our modality and methodology has typically been through storytelling, oral history, and memory work as the vehicle or the epistemic or the vehicle for retrieving and recovering stories that are excluded and so forth. And in the Indigenous projects, for example, a lot of it is about shifting about where memory sits and memory in land, in culture, in environment. And so part of the project for us has been about how do we use and how do we mobilize narrative methodologies in particular as forms of storytelling that sits with and can be in conversation with Aboriginal methodologies or methodologies like yarning. So the project for us is about an epistemic retrieval or epistemic work as the retrieval work that we do. And so all of those projects, to some extent, is about retrieving knowledges and so forth. It's very different, maybe in lots of ways, because ultimately giving land back is the core project of repatriation, and that's not happening for lots of obvious reasons. But then part of it is how do we use um, the powers of the university to support some of these projects. And I'm sure that universities one act a year because community groups themselves set themselves up to be able to do repatriation work. And so the question for me has always been about how best do we support those sorts of activities that is about retrieval, reclamation, and remembering as central to repatriation work. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think it does. I think it answers a lot of aspects. It is a fairly complicated question, and I'm sorry for just kind of throwing that out there the first time around. Um, yeah, so this kind of ties into my next question then. But it's a bit of a jump in terms of we're going from methodology towards content, the content of your research, which is the work you do working with immigrants and displaced peoples, as well as indigenous peoples. Your work in Next in Color, you raise discussions about entanglements between displaced and immigrant people with settler colonialism, but you also show a deeply transformative possibility for decolonization from the relationships between, indigenous peoples and immigrants and displaced peoples. So I'm curious on your thoughts on how we can foster a deeper and more healing solidarity between indigenous and displaced peoples, especially considering, how many displaced peoples were part of and are part of indigenous groups themselves in their homelands before displacement.
Yeah, look, and I think that's such an important comment. I mean, it's, and it's not even a new thing. This displacement, the displacements of peoples and so on. So, I mean, I'll tell you, a couple of personal maybe stories about that made me think about this work. So, I came to Australia too as a migrant. So that's the ultimate form of as a younger person and thinking about just the uprooting that happens, right? And then you think, now I'm in another place, and then you realize that in this place there's government discourses that tells you that you're a multicultural other or you belong to a multicultural ethnic community. There's nothing about indigenous people or First Peoples and so forth. This is work that we do later. And part of my experience and a number of other people's experiences is that the first time that you think and feel like you could belong is in the context of being with Aboriginal or First Nations people, because the welcome is so different, or the idea of of how and what the place means is so different. So those sorts of experiences, they're not unique to me, but they are the stories that recur when I speak with young people from very different diasporas. They are always concerned with their relationship to Indigenous people. And this is because of the lens of race or racialization and so forth, of being othered and excluded from a particular type of white discourse, white dialogue. But at the same time, people who identify as or think of themselves as white, they are also in this relationship of race and so forth. So I think the possibilities that we have come to understand as important is how do we create spaces for the encounters around Indigenous knowledges, Indigenous experiences, and how do we hold those spaces, and what is the role of bringing knowledges through arts practice, through conversation, so that we can understand the entangled histories. And it's extremely important to understand the entanglement and to shift beyond binary understandings, but also to understand the categories that we live through are externally imposed categories. And once we are asked to or think with and think relationally and reciprocally, which is sits so much at the heart of Indigenous belonging, it opens up very different possibilities for um, for the solidarity. Michelle Fine talks about some of this as fragilarities because it can be broken fairly easily also because of broader structures and so forth. But I think the contact zone, the encounter spaces, and the and thinking about entanglement as a as a as an epistemological departure point for how we do work means that we can actually then undo the categories that holds us or that solidifies particular borders, but then also allows us to think through, and think with other resources about who we are as humans um, in a particular context. Because if we think through the hard categories that is imposed by structures or colonial structures, then they are the ones that introduce us and hold hierarchies in place.
Yeah, yeah, that's really wise. That's really important. Um, and you also are literally creating these spaces for all these different groups of people with varying positionalities to come together and co-produce knowledge together, which is really transformative. Um, and looking at time and looking at questions, I think we should probably go ahead and move to the Q&A. Um, so we will just go ahead. I'll start reading out some questions from the audience. Um, if we are comfortable doing that. So to start, we have a question from Michelle Blom, who asks, how are electronic media, so like radio and photography, um, influenced by colonialism, both past and present? And how does the colonial character of these communication methods, how do they shape Indigenous voices in their expression?
Ooh, that's a that's a hard one. So let me. I th I think part of the sets of questions here is about who who generates things, and I think that all of these modalities of communication that people have developed over time um, isn't colonizing in and of itself. However, the ways who creates content, how is the content created, who has the algorithms to dictate content, and so forth. Those are really important questions. I think the sorts of ways in which we here, how, and the way that I have experienced these various modalities is that Aboriginal people, young people from the African diaspora and so forth, they use these technologies to repurpose them to generate the content that they think is important to generate. So these become the tools, and the ideology that informs what it is that we ask, how we ask it, and what we represent is to some extent determined by them.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. Um, so it really becomes about how do Indigenous people, and especially Indigenous youth, come to reshape the context in which they are creating. Am I getting that right?
Yes, I
Yeah.
think so. I think so because I mean we've created lots of podcasts now with young people, and I think it's I don't know if it's I mean it can be used to generate misinformation and so forth, but in some of these, I mean we see that every day. So I mean that in itself, the vehicle and the tool isn't colonizing or doesn't produce colonialisms in and of itself. I think it's the way that we put things to use and how we use these sorts of modalities that is really important to understand. Because I think with the young people here, they've created all sorts of ways, or I mean, they are at the young people are often at the forefront of being innovative around the use of technologies and so forth to represent themselves and so on. So I think some of that is really important. And I mean, and for us, for me, it's not to assume that these sorts of things are ever neutral, and that there's always a stake, there's always a voice, there's always a power, there's always something that shapes and influences this. And I think people who write around a lot of the disruptive technologies, and I mean, even when we search Google and so with the algorithms, there's particular sets of ways in which those who can shape the algorithm dictates often a lot of what we see and so on. But with our projects, they're sort of small, very local and so forth. So people are very intentional around thinking through the relationship, the ethics, whose representation, whose voice, and so on. And if it's indigenous led, there's all sorts of things that are all sorts of structures and processes that are put in place to ensure that indigenous voices are central to the decision making and to the design and to what is represented. And I think so those practices are really important, not only for research, but for lots of things that we do.
Mm, exactly. Moving to the next question from Alan Wang. For multimedia archives, while much information is preserved meaningfully, much about the context around said information it may be lost. For example, listening to an oral history loses the image of the narrator or the spatial place of the recording. How do we help exhibition passerby, for example, not just consume the archived information, but engage with it in a way that embraces the richness, intimacy, and importance of the context of the archive creation?
Oh, these sorts of things are all really they're all really challenging because so much of it then is about audience. It's about audience. There's some things that goes beyond the control of the people who create and and produce produce things. But I don't know, there's little things that we've done. For example, with the Sound Portraits project that we created, we also created a listening guide. And so the listening guide tells people a little bit about the history, the context, and it tells people about the different types of listening that's possible, how we listen with the inside ear, the outside ear. And it draws from I can't even remember a person's name now, but the people who produce the listening guide. What are the ways in which we listen and so forth? So for us, a really simple, well, it's not really simple. We thought about how might we get people to read the context, and it's really hard for people even to grasp what it meant to live in the apartheid state, what that actually felt like. So these voices hopefully conveys some of that. But the only thing that we were able to create alongside it, um, to avoid some of the sorts of pitfalls, was to say that look, this is something that you can use to read this website or to read the stories that we've collated on this website. The stuff about I don't know about commodification. I mean, I don't think that we've even the archives that we did or the exhibition that we did on the Black Women's Healing Project. That's I mean, there was very little risk of that being commodified because so much of it was just about getting permission, working with Aboriginal women, giving permission for it only to be exhibited, and that's as far as it went. But some of the other questions, they are really important questions, and I mean, I can take them. I will hold these because they are important questions for us to think about in this work. Yeah.
Yeah, and then that kind of ties into this next question. Honestly, this next couple of questions from Chrysovalantis Papathanassio, if I'm pronouncing that right. If I did not, I apologize deeply. How can refugee and migrant projects with a liberatory and decolonial orientation secure funding from international organizations, which are criticized for neocolonial practices, while ensuring that funding relationships remain ethical, locally accountable, and non-extractive? And I feel like that can connect well with this question from an anonymous attendee. How were ethical considerations implemented in this amazing study? So perhaps a good way to integrate these two. How are ethical considerations implemented from seeking funding uh, to the data collection process and then research communication process? How are you maintaining
Mm,
ethical considerations even with these kind of financial ties towards seeking funding?
mm. Okay, so I guess I mean, so in terms of the research projects itself, I think most research or work that we do that even comes from community spaces have to go through, I think you call them maybe review boards, and we call them human rights research and ethics committees. So we always tie the work that we do into those. We haven't sought international funding for our projects. Most of our projects have secured funding through through government and philanthropic agencies here. The the work that we've done that I know that is the ideas of the extractive the things that actually dictates us at the moment is that a lot of it will be there's an audit there's an audit to how did you spend your money and so forth. So a lot of what we do is that we try and push back and talk about, well, what are the rights, responsibilities, and so forth that needs to be in place for this work in the context of Aboriginal working in Indigenous and with Aboriginal communities. There's lots of conversations around data sovereignty, around Indigenous. It's a bit like nothing about us without us, and this is nothing about us without us. So we've got lots of things around in place around data sovereignty, around protocols that needs to be in place. Um, who are the communities that you have consulted with? How will they be co-authors? What will go back to them? How will things go back to them? How will they co-author on articles and so forth? In terms of the funding itself, I mean, we only get the the government funding or non-government funding here typically will want to see the projects delivered. Um, and then I think we put in place the protocols, the ethics, and those sorts of practices. But like I said, I can't answer the one in terms of international partnerships because I haven't actually, other than one small project that we did with Canada, but Canada's got a very similar infrastructure around ethics and ethics relationships to Australia. And that was community mobilization grant. So there already is something there about this has to be of benefit to community in some way. And then it's upon us to ensure that that's not extractive, but reciprocal, mutually reciprocal, and that we are upfront about what are what is this work for the academia and what are the implications of this work for the community groups who we work with. And in our context, again, with the Centre for Aboriginal Studies, the work that we often do is about firstly starts with and is with a commitment to community. And they talk about, or we talk about this as Aboriginal community controlled work. And so our questions are about what does it actually mean for us to engage in Aboriginal community controlled work, and what will that look like in relation to the actual execution of the projects in the real world.
Yeah. Um, and I feel like then we're having some discussions about funding. And so I think
Yeah,
this question,
I can see
this,
funding is really hard.
yeah, it's really difficult in this day and age.
It's really
I
difficult.
feel like this question ties into some of these discussions
Yeah.
further. Um, Kate Wright said, really beautiful work. Thank you for sharing. And they are curious to know about your funding, what you are able to share, right? Um,
Mm.
Funding opportunities
Yeah.
are difficult for these kinds of methodologies, and they'd love to hear your insight.
Yeah. So I think, look, I know that they are very difficult for this sort of work. So the way that I've tried to do this work, people have come to me from external organizations because they need evaluation done. And I would say typically to them, well, look, we can do evaluation work, which is fairly straightforward because the evaluation people typically want is about some comments about outcomes and some about process. And I would say that we can we can find ways to deepen the work so that we actually um, focus and center on documenting and using the funding or evaluation funding to document and support the processes of the work that we are actually interested in. Because so much of what people say and why people don't fund some of the arts-based work in our context is that somewhere it's community development projects and it's about supporting migrant communities. So we have to flip this we have to flip the script in a way, and we have to reorient how we use and what we want to invest into. And part of the task of the university is to demonstrate the importance and significance of process-oriented work if we want to see change. Not just the academics come in and they do this work, but we have to collaborate with the various agencies, community organizations who are typically cash strapped. So for me, it's about thinking very creatively and differently about how will I pull a scholarship and bring a scholarship into conversation with the needs of a project that has got limited funding. So that's how I've been doing this work, um, and making sure that evaluation is actually about knowledge creation in a deep way in these projects where it's possible.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's really important. Especially to get
Yes.
past the funders. Um,
Yeah.
So to move to our next question, which ties into, engagement and thinking about engagement with communities. Both Canada and Australia have seen the rise of the arts on a prescription model. Um, so using arts to promote health and well-being. Can you comment on
Mhm.
how Indigenous communities are included in these models, and how can this policy be more inclusive for marginalized peoples?
Oh, that's a hard one. Look, I'm not across some of the ways in which I mean, I think in Australia there is this move to around whether it's about arts or active living, arts for prescription. But I can't say because I haven't looked enough into where communities are excluded in terms of I'm not too sure how excluded they are because this would happen through our Medicare system, I think. But whether the question is about how our migrant knowledges and whose forms and modalities of therapy and so forth are included in this. If the question is about that, then I can probably say that look, there's a tremendous amount of work around the social emotional well-being model, especially in the psychology space, back to country, traditional healing practices, and so forth that people have been developing up over time. And so whether that's already in the system, I can't say, but there is a big movement that is concerned with expanding therapeutic modalities. Um, and I'd imagine that particular collective, because they have been looking at where are the knowledge over the last 20 or so years, especially around the social emotional well-being model that is indigenous led, indigenous informed. There's been a lot of work around how do we actually train people with and in those models? How do we create a broader pool of mental health workers that has indigenous knowledge systems, but then also the whether this how we translate that into these are also things that medical professionals or what is it paraprofessionals or allied health services can implement. I don't think that we're there yet, and so that's also still work that needs to happen.
Hmm. Yeah. We have time for one more question. One more short question, if I can find it. Um, we'll just do this next question. So an anonymous attendee is asking about the role of professional artists in your collaborations.
But oh yeah, we've got a lot of people who are, I mean, most of the people we work with are professional artists. So sometimes they are employed or sometimes they get employed on the projects themselves. But all of the people that we've been working with in the Next in Color and so forth, they are all either they call themselves cultural practitioners, I think some of them would say. Some people are professional artists, and Paola Bella would probably describe herself as a professional artist. So professional artists are extremely important to this work because they bring a wealth of experience and knowledge. I think I'm not an artist myself. I work with and I engage with lots of people who can turn this extremely important domain of culture of culture, not just the artistic output, but culture as one of the fairly foundational things to human life and how we actually mobilize that. And I think the role of professional artists and arts workers as partners or as co-creators is vital. And I think that's how that relationship um, and continues to be in our work, that they are partners in the co-creation of the projects.
Yeah, and with that, I want to thank you one more time for your wonderful presentation, and I want to thank all of our participants today for engaging with these really important and sometimes tense topics concerning, decolonization and solidarity among different groups, as well as just arts-based methods in general. I hope we've all, received a good amount of insight into how these modalities and how arts-based modalities can really transform the research process into something that is helpful and meaningful for marginalized groups. And with that, I would like to return it to Sarah to close us out.
Thank you so very much. This was just fantastic, and there have been many people thanking you, Dr. Sonn, for this great talk and finding it very stimulating and generative. Thank you, Aidan, for fantastic moderation and good, sometimes challenging questions for Chris. And thank you to all of you for being here today as part of this IIQM event. I want to thank the IIQM team, our small but mighty team, for all the work that went into making this series happen. The next talk is in early April with Dr. Carla Rice, and we've put in the chat the link for information and registration for that next talk, which is entitled The Work of Stories in the World. So thank you very much, and we hope to see you at our future events.